I want to start off by setting a little bit of context here. There's a reason why we have these two particular people here, and it's not just because we all went to undergrad together. These are two individuals who are very deeply involved in the intersection of government and technology, but have also spent time deeply ingrained in the private sector, right? So, this isn't going to be a conversation with some folks who have never actually lived or operated in the real world. And so let's start off with a bit of an introduction. We'll start with Sana. Tell us the story that got you from Burnaby Mountain to here.
Well, is this on? Yes, okay. I'm going to take a very quick explanation of that, but very happy to talk to people a bit longer. So I've been doing tech and business for about 25 years. I've worked in industry and in the public sector, and now I'm dipping my toe a little bit in kind of academia. I am currently Professor of Practice in AI at King's College London, and I am part of the leadership team for the UK government's flagship product or grant on responsible AI. So it's looking at seeding responsible AI across the ecosystem. My work in the public sector has spanned a bunch of different things. So I initially worked with a small team in the UK to set up Government Digital Service, which was about taking government services, 30 of the most used public services, online. And we did that in 2012 and 2013. Within 6 months, we took government spend from 1.2 billion annually. I feel like that needs to take a minute there. 1.2 billion pounds annually the UK government was spending on tech in 2010. I mean, you have to try really hard to spend that much money. And we took that down within 6 months to about half that, and now it runs around 1.2, 2.1, something like that annually, million. And then I came back to government to set up the Office for AI. So we were the first country in the world to put AI policymaking at the heart of central government. I wrote the National AI Strategy and the AI Regulation White Paper, which is the way that the UK is going to deal with regulating AI. And I've worked very closely with Google DeepMind and a lot of other players in this space. And yeah, my work now is around advising both industry and public sector, as well as the third sector. And I hold a bunch of board positions and things like that, so I keep myself busy.
All right, so not too much. Shivam?
I love when people say people have got public-private sector experience and they say, yeah, they've worked in the private sector and they've got real-world experience, because government clearly is operating outside the real-world scenarios. But it's brilliant. It really is, honestly. It's a parallel universe of sorts. But no, it's lovely to be here. Thank you, Chris, for having us, of course. My name is Shivam, and my background very much like Sama's has really been a blend of public-private experiences. My background's in engineering, and I did my master's in environmental law, so that's the intersection. It's digital transformation in the context of environmental sustainability. That's been most of my life. I was in the management consulting world, working with large consulting firms, focused on digital transformation, large tech, large finance, with the idea, this hopeful idea that how do we start to create new organizational models that allow us to also enhance environmental and social outcomes in addition to the bottom line gains. Wishful idea, some people call, but it's starting to take root. Over the last 20, 25 years, it's certainly made a bit more progress. Bottom line gains still remain the prime driver of our economy, but I think there is an increased conversation on how do we also start to realize economical and social gains in addition to it. So that's been the idea. Moved over to the public sector, starting with the City of Vancouver. I was the City of Vancouver's head for tech and sustainability. And then over the last many years, I've had the privilege of working with the United Nations, where I've been overseeing the work with governments across the world in helping them build out their data and digital strategies, with the focus on particularly environmental resiliency, but increasingly social cohesion as well. So it's been an interesting journey, both in terms of exploring how the world is responding to the growth of tech, but also at the same time, How do we balance the ecological factors that govern all of us and also the social factors that govern all of us? So it's been a very interesting balance to see.
So historically, right, governments haven't really understood tech, right? They haven't necessarily utilized it effectively, or maybe they've spent an incredible amount of money on it. And oftentimes, and this isn't an indicative of any particular geography, right? A lot of folks in government tend to be behind the curve when it comes to understanding the potential and where things are going in terms of startup land, right? With AI, suddenly we went from going about this fast to going like this, right? So do governments understand what's going on with AI? Is there any hope of them keeping up? And do they really understand the potential changes for their communities, their ecosystems, their economies? What's the status?
Sort of. It depends. Those are the answers, I think, in general for these questions. Some understand more than others, I think, but everybody understands the importance of these set of technologies, and that they need to be looking at it more. You have, across the world, it's been my experience that you've got kind of the people who are in our countries who are very commercially driven, and then you have countries that are authoritarian and led by government thinking, and then you have everyone in the middle. I'll leave to you to decide who sits where, but it doesn't take much thinking. And then within that, you have people who are scared and feel like they've missed the boat already and want to shy away from it. You have people who are moving really fast and maybe not making the best decisions. You have an inordinate amount of advice shouted at government from all different groups. And government's trying to do their best. And I can't speak for government anymore because I'm not there, because I got out. But they do try to listen. And I think, one of the things we were trying to do very hard when I was running this in the UK government was trying to listen to a variety of voices from the ecosystem. Because from a public perspective, from a social good perspective, right? If you're listening only to the loudest voices, then you're kind of missing the drivers and the incentives that others in the ecosystem have. And often it's hard to hear that. But if you're going to try and create a set of technologies that benefits society as a whole, you need to have a representation of that kind of offering advice in order for you to create the right sort of policies that further the country's kind of economics or social status, right? And so these are, I guess, some of the things governments, and some are doing it better than others.
Maybe I can add a bit more global sort of perspective to what you just said, because it's perfectly put. But maybe there's some interesting anecdotes to perhaps share that might be of interest. So there's about 60-odd countries across the world now that have got some sort of an AI or a data strategy nationally. Right, so we've got 193 official countries, 60 of them officially have some AI data strategy nationally that is tied to operational funding for countries that is ranging from the upwards of $100 billion in the cases of France or America or China to $2 to $5 billion like India or Canada or Australia, for example. So that's a big of a variance. But also in there was a very interesting study that was done, of which I was a part of last year, I think, where we looked at 14 countries across the world, and we spoke to government folks, a few thousand of them, to really understand what is the appetite and how well do they understand AI, yeah? And what we found was very interesting. So about 65% of folks, of those who were surveyed across 14 countries, said that they recognize that AI is important for two particular things. First, reducing the bottom lines in the government, reducing costs of government operations, but also bettering the delivery of public services. The adoption, however, of AI was about 25%, right? So even though 65% of people in the government are recognizing the importance, aptly so, in the right areas, the adoption remains 25%. Now, there's interesting reasons we can go to as to why that is the case. I'm sure we've got some interesting ideas on there and observations on there. And the last interesting tidbit there is when you look at, okay, so there's 25%, there is adoption of that. Where is it going within the government? Yeah? And across the world, the biggest procurer of AI within the governments globally as an average out is the defense. So in America, for example, 90% of all government procurement is happening at the defense department, right? And then quickly following defense is health. Quickly following health is infrastructure, tele. You know, so it's an interesting sort of spread that you're starting to see, and that's indicative. I've got a privilege of having a global vantage point, so I'm seeing this globally very much the case. The picture is being sort of, it's not like one country standing out as being very different than the other. These trends seem to be replicating globally. So I think that sort of gives you an idea of where and how AI is being positioned within the government globally.
And so, you know, both of you just made comments about kind of the diversity of countries around the world, right? You know, about 60 countries that are you know, putting some concerted effort towards AI. We alluded to the spread and the diversity of perspectives within governments and their objectives. You know, historically, technology hasn't spread that fast, right? You know, technology might start in Silicon Valley and eventually somebody would sell it into Canada and into Europe and whatnot. Alongside the rise of AI, we've also seen this meaningful shift where technology is effectively distribution global from day one, right? I can start something now and I can sell it into 190 countries. Notwithstanding a small number of authoritarian countries that can effectively cut off the internet, right? How is this impacting the way governments think about regulating technology? And maybe to just sort of double click on a point of your experience, right? One of the initiatives you were involved in was the formation of GDPR, right? Which involved regulations across the entire EU. You know, talk a bit about what that experience was like, I guess about 10 years ago now, and you know, given how long it takes to get these different governments to sort of think about things the same way, what does that mean in a world where, hey, by the way, OpenAI is already like 90% utilization and you're late to the party to figure it out?
I think it's that struggle between how quickly a government moves, particularly in the context of regulation, compared to the pace at which a given industry moves, has always been a point of contention for governments, not just in the technology space, but for everything else as well. Technology has certainly, or digital tech particularly, has certainly heightened that gap and that tension. Right, so in the case of GDPR, for example, or even CSRDD, which was the newer initiative that just got as a tack onto GDPR, it takes time, right? I mean, and we have to recognize that it is very easy to blame the governments for being slow and for being over-regulatory. But the duty of a government is that of public interest, just like the duty of a corporation, fiduciary duty, is to maximize shareholder gains. Right, so when you've got a very clear aim from a corporate standpoint, which is to maximize bottom line gains, it is a fairly clear directive. That is what you go after. In the government's case, when you're talking about acting in public's interest, it's a very subjective undertaking. And so hence why it becomes a very interesting dialogue. In GDPR, we had the same dialogues. We had over consultations over 5 years, really, to get to a point where there could be some level of agreement achieved in terms of what is it that we put in terms of safeguards that allow innovation to progress and advance, whilst making sure that the public interest remains paramount. And sometimes that balance is not achieved, and sometimes it's incredibly hard. So in the governments, what I'm seeing now in terms of enhancing that cycle of regulatory passage is adaptive governance. I'm sure you're seeing it as well. I would love to sort of, and that's a very interesting idea. So you're basically leveraging the sandboxing idea from the startups ecosystems, and you're applying it within the government context. And this is not conceptual thinking, this is happening right now. Multiple governments across the world are starting to think about regulatory sandboxes, which is basically what you would classify in the classical sense sandboxes in the startups, and saying, how does that apply to the governments? Yeah? So you take a regulation, let's say GDPR in this case, and rather than saying we're going to get a perfect regulatory narrative and we're going to pass it across all countries, we say let's create a very, very, very small group and we have a very, very rudimentary understanding of what a policy could be in a given context, and then we trial it. And then based on the trials, we adapt and expand. based on the adoption and expand. It becomes a cyclical narrative. And so that is one way that I'm seeing where governments are trying to really catch up. And we have to recognize, at least in my view, it'll always be a catch-up game. Because the role of the government is very much to create the enabling environments that allow technologies to run. Yeah. Now, of course, we can have a whole conversation on how the government, in very many cases, are itself being run by the technology companies because the lobbying is a real thing, and there is data, plenty enough of it to back it up. And I don't think it applies as cleanly as it used to be in the cases of what would define authoritarianism or what would define democracies, because we have democracies where internet is being cut off just like that. So I think it's a very interesting balance, but I would love to get your thoughts on this as well, if you're seeing something similar to what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean, the regulatory sandboxes, in fact, is a really interesting one because that came out of the UK. So in the financial sector a number of years ago, no innovation was happening because it's a highly, highly regulated industry, as anyone who's in banking knows. And in order to help that, the Financial Conduct Authority actually created a sandbox. So put the regulator themselves and put innovators and put the bank all inside this room and essentially started innovating there. So it allowed innovation to happen in a safe environment and then decided kind of what to do. And that was the start of things like Monzo and various other things now in the UK, which, you know, has seen a massive uptick of innovation in finance. But in terms of regulation on AI, it's a really interesting one. And I've spent a lot of time talking to people about the difficulty of having a universal AI regulator. Because where do you, like, let's just, I mean, I spent 2 hours with a reporter just unpicking the question, because I was like, I'm not going to comment on a universal AI regulator because none of that makes sense at all, right? Right, you need context, etc. But if we talk just, you know, concretely about the kind of approaches that exist, there are, China, for example, is the most regulated country when it comes to AI, which is probably not what people think, but it is the most regulated from an ethics perspective as well. And the two approaches at the moment on the table are kind of the UK and the EU. And the EU has an AI Act, and they do this very kind of risk-driven. So they basically decide how risky the service is, and then based on that risk level, you are regulated. So it regulates all of AI based on risk. The UK, the approach is much more context-driven. So what is the application that this, you know, application is pertaining to? And then it falls under that specific regulator. So you say, right, I have some facial recognition technology. We don't look at that on its own. We think about, is that in a medical context? Is that to open your cell phone? Is it, you know, where on the spectrum does this lie? And then you kind of bring in the right regulators. Now, both of these are moving closer to each other. So the EU system is saying, right, well, actually, we need some context. And the UK is saying, well, actually, we need some, you know, central coordination across regulators, because we can't expect, you know, startup founders to be thinking, how many regulators purview do I fit under, right? Some of that needs to be done. So you can't say, oh, I need to think about the Financial Conduct Authority. I need to think about the Data Authority. I need to think about all these things. We need to coordinate. So right now, we're in kind of uncharted territories. Nobody really knows, right? But the kind of easy answer here is that we need to be approaching with responsibility at the core of whatever we do, and that is for every single person in this room, but every single person in the world, right? And we spend a lot of time early doors in AI talking about ethics, but ethics doesn't cover everything. That's why we've changed this term now, and we talk about it as responsibility, right? Because it's not just the ethical responsibility. It's not. It has to include the environmental impact. It has to include things you said earlier in the previous conversation, which is the impacts of jobs and productivity, right? Because we throw these things around like, you know, AI will, you know, in absolutely unspecific terms, create this massive productivity gain for a country. But nobody asks, what will you do with the productivity gains? what is it that we're going to do with those productivity gains? And those are questions that, the senior members of a company, the founding members of a company need to be thinking about now, right? Not in the future when you get to the point of this, now.
But also I think that is where we're seeing a lot of governments approach this from as well. Right? So you're starting to see, just like you were saying, the context and the risk-based approach to AI regulation is coming together. Like Singapore is a great example, by the way, of where this is intersecting in a very smart way. Rwanda is a very fantastic example as well of where this is intersecting in a very smart way. But also just in that way, I'm also seeing the sort of coming together of responsible AI narratives within the public sector, in a big way. Even though in the last 5 years, I think this shift from saying we need to just look at AI regulation from a risk context perspective, and now there's this underlying tonality of responsibility. What does responsibility look like in the context? And that's, again, a very nebulous, very large question to which there aren't very many direct answers, but at least it is a conversation, right? And I think it's always sort of, the interesting question, I think, in the next few years will always be this sort of balance between how much frustration can the private sector take with the government while it thinks through regulations and responsibilities, because that is a challenge. In the EU, because people argue, right? I mean, if you want to innovate, you go to the Valley because America is the Wild West for regulations. You do basically whatever the hell you want. You go to EU when you want to get regulated, and that is this. But I do think that is not a very correct characteristic of how ecosystems operate. It's a very simplistic and easy to soundbite idea. But I do think there's a lot more complexity, where if you look at the innovation coming out of the EU in spite of the regulatory environment, it is working,
I might interrupt for a second. The word "in spite of." I personally think regulation allows us to go faster, right? So if you are regulated, you can innovate more, because if you know what the boundaries are, you're less worried about getting caught by them, right? And so if you think about cars, seatbelts were made to let you go faster, right? We drove really slowly before there were seatbelts, really, really slowly, right? So, and this isn't to say that, willy-nilly people should be throwing regulation in front of you, right? But thoughtful regulation allows companies to move faster because they can make decisions. So if you look at big incumbent companies who are not in the tech sector, but I'm talking about in an economy, the incumbents who should be buying your products, right? Who should be moving and buying your products, they won't if they think they're going to get wrapped on the knuckles, right? They're not going to do that tech transformation unless they know that the tech that you're offering them is sound and is okay, right? This kind of goes back to the adage of no one got fired for buying IBM, right? or Microsoft or Google, right? But the point is, if you're putting something in the market and you can't say this is why it's safe, this is why it's okay, and this is how it's protecting you, it's not gonna take off. So regulation helps innovation.
All right. We've got time for one question from the audience. We got one back there.
So recently the French Senate discovered that Microsoft had been breaching its own law and had been exporting data to the States despite French law saying that's not acceptable. How are more governments moving towards air-gapping their national data sets?
We were just talking about this yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, go for it.
You go. I mean, I can talk from the UK's perspective. This was incredibly important for the UK when we first set up. So in kind of the 2010s, when we were setting up Government Digital Service, and we agreed with Microsoft that the only way for Microsoft to work with the UK was to actually bring their servers on the UK, into the UK. And that was the first foray of Microsoft outside of Redwood. They brought them and they put them in Ireland. And that was an agreement with the UK government and as the only option to do this, right? And more broad, and so that's at the concrete example of kind of what a country does. right now, the conversation across most countries, and I'm sure Shivam will talk about this a little bit as well, is this concept of sovereign AI, which again is a very broad, big term. What do we mean by sovereignty? How far down the stack are you going? Are we talking about silicon, for example, and who's sand, right? But, how far down are we going, right? And I think this question, there's an education piece to this, right? And also practical parts of this that governments need to kind of work through rather than making these big grand claims, right? But incredibly important, as most of the hyperscalers are American, for the rest of the country, the rest of the world, every country in the world, to know that they can't be held to account by an unelected entity, right? And so that's why this conversation is huge. It's being spoken at kind of at every venue at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's exactly it. I think also to remember, look, the Cloud Act, are you familiar with the Cloud Act in the US? Yeah, most of you should be. If not, you should be familiar with the Cloud Act in the US because it does basically legally allow for American corporations, it's a back channel that allows American corporations to share data with the American government under certain circumstances, right? So every country that is using the organization's infrastructure, like Microsoft, like AWS, like Google, they all in some way are vulnerable to this, yeah? And that is quite literally, these four organizations are controlling about 70% of the world's global data AI infrastructure, right? So this is the fact, right? And this conversation is extremely real now. Yeah. It has been real for some parts of the world for the last 10 years, but in Canada particularly, it has become very real in the last year, yeah? And so as a Canadian citizen who's, I've been involved in the Canadian government conversations around this, like I was saying, it's not just a problem in France or in the UK, it is a global problem because of the level of dependency that the governments have on the infrastructure of certain organizations. And so looking at examples from China, looking at examples from the UK, where they have created mechanisms that allow certain public services to be held in public cloud infrastructure with backups in some of the hyperscalers, but the fundamental data sources continue to be within public firewalls, in public secure services. So I think this is a very important, very interesting conversation, which could again take a long time, but
yep.
you got a fun point.
No, I was just gonna make a final point, but I was gonna, if you had any.
Make your final point and then.
So it feels quite lofty, I suspect, listening to what our government's doing, how our government's thinking about AI, blah, blah, blah. But if I were to leave you each with a thing to take away from this conversation, it's that they need you to get it right. The voices that you have, the experiences that you have, the things that you need in order to enable the things that you're doing, don't wait to engage with policy. And they do have, as hard as it feels to break through, they do have an open door policy for everyone. So just as the chap up here from Google was saying, like he wants to work with you. Government very much will only succeed if you succeed. And so they need to hear from you. If things are broken, they're not working, your voices matter, and you need to use them. So don't wait, talk to them.
Democracies can't work without engagement.
All right, so I'm gonna give one last question to Sana to end on that note. You were, I believe, the first person in the world to hold the role of head of office of AI for any country's government. Awesome. BC recently anointed a new Minister of State of AI. Based on your experience, positive, negative, and otherwise, what words of advice would you give to him if you were to say, pay attention to this, look over here, this is important?
Yeah. Oh, thanks for an easy question. I think the advice I would give is simply that AI isn't magic. It's not magic dust. Added in isolation to existing solutions that government has, it's not going to create all and end up with all of the positive things that government wants. And so I would encourage the new minister to really dive into the ecosystem and understand the challenges. So both in helping to foster the ecosystem here in BC and more broadly across Canada, but also to look at what are the challenges that the city has from a service delivery perspective? What are the challenges that industry have from an adoption of AI perspective? Where is there not enough grant funding, innovation, R&D funding? Understand these problems and look at the levers that you have before jumping to the more AI is better. Because sometimes just a little Excel will do it.
Amazing. Thank you both for joining us today.